So if you have a disorder that is known to be treatable and the primary approach to treating it, demonstrated by clinical research, is medication, then it makes a lot of sense for you to take it.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right, hello friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 345. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people just like you. And today we are back with another question and answer episode, 2 awesome questions from listeners like yourselves. If you would like to send me a question for a future episode of the show, please shoot me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. The website is still in progress, though we are making headway. My wife, Joelle, has been putting a lot of work into it this week and last week. And it should be up pretty soon. And it's going to look good and it's going to be functional. And that will be the place where you can find, older episodes, show notes, including transcripts for current episodes, blog posts based on the content of different episodes that I've done. And of course, like the mailing list and all those sorts of goodies. So it's going to be the same URL. It's still going to be duffthepsych.com. It's just under construction because we broke it. I also wanted to give another special shout out to a member of the Duff the Psych team that is no longer going to be working with us. And his name is Danny. Danny has been basically, on his email signature, it says manager of miscellany because he's done all sorts of different stuff for the Duff the Psych brand, including, writing blog posts based on the content of podcast episodes. He's been integral in helping the podcast, sort of get rolling each week, reaching out to people when needed, doing various administrative tasks and lots of behind the scenes stuff. So Danny, if you're listening, I just want to thank you for all the work you've done, over the years. I really, really appreciate you, and whatever life holds for you right now, I wish you the best of luck. With that, I wanted to let you guys know that this week has kind of kicked my ass, so I'm going to do my best. Please have some grace with me if I fumble my words a little bit or get tied up at all, because I actually tried to record this yesterday as well, and after several attempts, I'm like, fuck this, it's not working. My brain's just not there. And then today I had what I thought would be a 2-hour, 3-hour appointment that turned into a 5-hour appointment for testing. And it was a complex forensic legal case that involved a lot of information. So my brain's kind of fried. So I'm going to do my best. But like I said, please have some grace with me if I am not up to my, the best standards. But anyway, I'm going to try to not be terrible. And why don't we go ahead and just jump into the first question. It reads, "Hi, love your podcast and everything you do so much. You have amazing insight and hopefully you have some for this too. Thank you. I've been on psychiatric medication for around half my life, ever since I was first diagnosed with mental illness at 12 years old, and now I'm almost 23. I've experimented with dozens of them, but I have found a combination that has worked consistently, so talking about medication. It's become inevitable that I will be on medication even longer. Without my current concoction of high doses of mood stabilizers, mainly targeting my diagnosis of bipolar 2, I'm simply not functional and usually end up just plain suicidal. Also, I've recently entered a new romantic relationship, and of course, I eventually let him know. And it's things like that that make me so frustrated. I'm so lucky that he has no overt qualms about it, but it's never guaranteed I'll be that lucky. I find my need for medication to be embarrassing, to say the least. I just want off my meds. They've caused me hypothyroidism, which put me on additional medication. They made me gain and keep on massive amounts of weight, and some other unpleasant side effects, though none of them are life-changing, I guess. I would not be alive without them, but my quality of life would improve without them. I suppose I'm trying to say, how can I accept that this was where I'm at? I'm more stable than I've been in my entire life at the moment, but it just feels like it would be better without the darn medication. Thanks a lot. Okay, thank you for this question. I think that there are a lot of people that will resonate with it because it is a common experience to go through something similar to what you're going through when you are on psychiatric medication. So I really appreciate you writing in and giving me the opportunity to talk about it kind of broadly, as well as addressing your specific situation. I wanted to start by recognizing that you said you've had to struggle with mental illness since you were a child, since you were like a preteen, and that you've on and off experienced suicidality. So that's intense. And your concerns about the medication and everything are valid, which we'll talk about in depth here. But I first want to say that I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're around, and I'm glad that you're here to write in this question. And I'm very, very proud of you for fighting back and not giving up on this. It sounds like you've had to do a good amount of trial and error to find a medication regime that works well for you. And that's often the case. It takes a little bit of doing. It takes some experimentation, trial and error. And a lot of times people don't see that through and end up not finding something that works well. So even though these medications are a pain in your ass, I'm really glad to hear you say that you're more stable than you've ever been in your life at the moment. That's great. Everyone's experience with medication is different, so yours is totally valid, and I'm glad that you're sharing it here. You mentioned that your partner is cool about your medications, that he didn't have any, was it? Yes, he. Sorry, I want to make sure I wasn't misgendering your partner. So you mentioned that your new partner was cool about the medications and didn't have any overt qualms about it, which is great. I think that this is more and more common these days. I think that it's becoming more common for people to talk about their mental health in general, including medications, during the dating process. It's something that is just more talked about, and it is context that I think a lot of people are more willing to share because it's important. And it's more normalized than it has been in the past, right? People will even, joke about having to talk about which medications they're on before they have sex together, right? Like, hey, my medication makes it hard for me to orgasm. You should know that before we jump into bed. So there is a lot more talk about this in a more normalized way. But we're still having to face stigma, and I'll talk more about that. I think that your concern about other potential partners not being as okay with medication is interesting. It points to the fact that while there are a lot of areas of progress where acceptance of mental health conditions has gone up, there's still that degree of external and internal stigma attached to them. And when I say stigma, basically I just mean judgment, feelings of judgment from other people and feelings of judgment of your own self, like you talked about it being embarrassing. You mentioned you find your need to be on medication embarrassing. And I'm sure that if you've shared this before with any of your healthcare providers or people that care about you in your life, they've pointed out sort of the discrepancy there between physical health conditions and mental health conditions. There are obviously some people that do feel embarrassed about the need to be on medications for physical health conditions. So, for instance, if they're on a medication for some sort of, prostate issue, or have to be on hormones, or any number of things, people could be somewhat embarrassed by that if it's just a physiological condition. But I would say that it's a lot more common for people to be embarrassed about mental health conditions. And I get where that's coming from, but when you think about it from a logical perspective, it is a little illogical, I think. And that's not a judgment of how you feel. I'm just saying, from a logical perspective. You said that one of your primary targets is treatment for bipolar 2. So I'll just give you a little bit of information about that. I'm not sure if you are aware of this stuff yet or not, but bipolar has been on my mind a lot. It's going to be the topic of the next book that I'm currently writing. I'm about 3, I don't know what you call them, chapters. It's a question and answer book, basically similar to the format of this podcast, but more in depth. And so I'm about 3 questions into the book right now. So I'm really thinking a lot about bipolar and doing more research to make sure that I'm, saying things correctly. But bipolar is a tricky disorder to treat. The research shows that bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 have similar rates of treatment success. And I should just briefly mention what the difference is. Bipolar 1 is where you have what you call full manic phases. So these are periods of a week or more where you are experiencing symptoms like euphoric mood, elevations in energy, especially restless or creative energy, sometimes trouble with judgment and decision making, sometimes impulsive decisions, grandiosity, all sorts of fun stuff. And the symptoms are basically similar for bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. But with bipolar 2, you have what are called hypomanic phases, meaning similar in terms of the quality of them. But unlike bipolar 1, they're not to the extent that they really, really, really interfere with your life in a significant way. So meaning they're not, keeping you from holding a job or ruining your relationships, at least, in a very overt way. And of course, if there is any psychosis, meaning, seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, or having delusional beliefs, that would automatically qualify as bipolar 1 in a full manic episode. So regardless of the fact that they are, different in terms of severity, the rates of success in treatment are very similar between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. The thing about bipolar 2 is it can be harder to detect. It can fly under the radar, which means that sometimes people go for years without getting appropriate treatment or no treatment at all. Now, bipolar disorders are much more dependent on medication than something like just anxiety or depression. And the research shows that bipolar is notoriously hard to treat without medication. Estimates put the remission of symptoms, meaning, getting rid of bipolar symptoms almost entirely, without medications, that's at about 20 to 30%. So 20 to 30% of people, on their own efforts and spontaneously will have a remission of symptoms. But those rates are 50 to 70% with medication, right? So we're seeing a huge difference there. And if we lower the standard, lower the bar a little bit and just look at a significant reduction of symptoms rather than full remission, that number with medication jumps up to 80 to 90%. So it's not only a disorder or a group of disorders that are highly dependent on medication, those medications are also shown to be quite effective for them. So if you have a disorder that is known to be treatable and the primary approach to treating it, demonstrated by clinical research, is medication, then it makes a lot of sense for you to take it, right? So if we pull it back to the physical health side, individually, me personally, I have asthma and it's, pretty decent. It's moderate to severe, I would say. I've had it for a very long time since I was a kid. It does get in the way of my life. If I don't have, the medication, it really does. I would be in a bad spot. I can't be without medication. And there are certain things that I can do to work on it. I try to get regular cardiovascular exercise through running and other movement. I can avoid excess allergens, things that I know that I'm allergic to that set that off. I can try to find a place to live in that has relatively clean air, which I have. But I'm never going to expect to be completely off medication for it. That's just going to be the case for my entire life. I will probably always have an inhaler unless some miracle happens. So it's similar in terms of concept and just logically looking at it, but I do understand it's really hard to undo that stigma, especially the internalized stigma in yourself related to mental health conditions. There's a lot of factors there. Society, the way that you were raised, all these things can make you feel like you have bipolar because you failed at something or you didn't try hard enough. And that's simply not the case. We don't know exactly why bipolar happens. We know there are some pieces of maybe genetics, and of course there are things that happen in your life that contribute to it, but we know that it's not because you did something wrong or that it's a lack of effort or being lazy or something like that. It's a brain disease, and it's something that you obviously, in this case, require treatment for, and there is nothing wrong with that. You're not damaged goods. You're not weak. You haven't failed to take care of yourself. In fact, by doing the work and finding medications that work for you, I think you're doing a very brave and strong thing, and something that's very responsible by getting that treatment and not letting it rule your entire life. So I'm going to continue talking about this, but first I need to take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. Okay, this episode is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Getting to know yourself can be a lifelong process. We are always growing. We are always changing. I spend a lot of time doing self-reflection, as I talk about on the show frequently, whether it's talking to myself out loud or journaling. And there's a lot of work that you can do on your own, but I also want to be clear that sometimes you really need an outside perspective. And one of the ways you can do that is through therapy. Therapy is all about deepening your self-awareness and understanding. Sometimes we don't know the way things look from the outside or what we want, why we react the way we do. And talking through things can really help. So BetterHelp is an app that connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. If you find that you are needing help with your own personal exploration, if you are finding that you need help setting boundaries in your life, if you find that you are lacking in the coping skills necessary to get through your day without a mental health difficulty really upending things, you might want to look at therapy. So if you're thinking about it, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and that'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. And if you need to switch therapists, it's free. You could do it at no additional charge, and you can do it anytime you need to. So you can really search for somebody that's a good fit. So if you want to discover your potential with BetterHelp, visit betterhelp.com/duff and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P, betterhelp.com/duff for 10% off your first month. All right, so let's get back to the question here. So I think it's wise of you to be looking forward at the future and thinking about how you might continue requiring these medications and what you might do about that. And I think in all likelihood, you will require these medications over the long term. And you're allowed to feel whatever way you do about that. If you're disappointed, embarrassed, frustrated, scared, all of those are valid feelings. It just stands that with the exact type of disorder you have, there's a good chance that you are going to remain on those medications. So I just want to be clear about that. I'm not going to give you some sort of placating response. I want to be real with you. I don't want to minimize what you're experiencing. I'm sure that you recognize it's amazing to have resources to get appropriate treatment and to help stabilize things. But that's not what this is about. We're talking about the fact that there is no free lunch when it comes to medications. When I say that, I mean with the primary effects of medication, you're almost always going to have side effects as well. That's just how it works. Say we want to increase dopamine in somebody because they have Parkinson's disease. So they have movement issues caused by lack of dopamine in a part of their brain called the substantia nigra. And unfortunately, the way the medications work, we can't just pinpoint add dopamine to that specific region of the brain. No, we just increase dopamine in the brain, either by a direct route or an indirect route. And because of that, you're increasing other areas of the brain in terms of how much dopamine's there, and that can lead to unwanted side effects. In particular, when you have too much dopamine in the frontal lobes of the brain, that's when you get things like hallucinations or other types of psychosis. So yeah, there's no free lunch, and that's what gets you into what we would call polypharmacy territory, as you talked about in your question, where you use a medication to treat the side effects of another medication. So like you talked about taking medication to counteract the hypothyroidism that's occurred as a result of taking your mood stabilizer. I'm not sure which mood stabilizer you're on, but lithium is a very, very common one. And recent research within the past few years indicates that up to 20% of people that take lithium may develop hypothyroidism, meaning underproduction of thyroid hormone. And as we've talked about in a recent episode, that leads to things like lethargy, feelings of depression, slowing down of a lot of the body processes. Other medications have a smaller risk, so maybe this is one that you're on. Not entirely sure, but there are others that can also cause hypothyroidism. The risk is just lower than lithium. All this is to say what you're experiencing is common, and it can be frustrating, and it leaves you in a bit of a catch-22 situation where you want to maintain your hard-earned stability in life, but you're also frustrated with the impacts of the medication. I think that in some cases, the side effects can, be really important to consider. They could contribute to worsening of mental health if they get in the way of your life. Say a surgeon, you have a plastic surgeon or a neurosurgeon, they really can't take medication that causes tremor. Lithium would be one of those because that's not compatible with their career. They have to have good fine motor skills and not be shaking. For you, maybe you're very upset about the weight gain that's occurred on medication, which can lead to feelings of depression or low self-esteem. So, side effects, calling them side effects makes it sound like, oh, well, it's just another extra thing on the side. They can be really impactful. So just don't want to minimize that. They can suck, and there is no free lunch, unfortunately, at least not yet. Hopefully someday we can get in there with, cut open with a laser and just drop in the exact neurotransmitter where you need it, when you need it, but we're not there right now. So what can you do about this? There are obviously options of other medications, but it sounds like you've already done all of that. It sounds like you've done a lot of hard work to figure out what works well for you. So I wouldn't want to screw with that if we're already with something good. If you aren't in therapy, obviously that could be an important component. As I mentioned, medication is pretty necessary for bipolar. There's also a lot of work, though, that can be done in terms of recognizing your tendencies, putting systems in place to keep you safe when the mood shifts do occur. And also in therapy, you could be working on dismantling the stigma that you feel related to taking medications in the first place. Maybe assumptions that you need to check, such as the assumption that a potential partner will not like you anymore because of your medications, or wherever your brain goes with that. When it comes to treatments with other medications, I know that a lot of people these days think about things like psychedelics. So psilocybin, meaning magic mushrooms, or LSD, ketamine, MDMA, different types of psychedelics or hypnotics. And for bipolar, I would say that the research is pretty limited and mixed, not great. There's also some evidence. There are documented cases of psychedelics triggering mood episodes like mania. So I would definitely be careful with that. Obviously, really talk with your providers about anything in that realm that you're considering. I'd also ask, what you might be doing to support your overall health in addition to the medications. For example, weight gain and thyroid function. For those things, you know what I'm going to say, right? Physical exercise is extremely helpful. Not always easy to do when you feel lethargic because your thyroid is underproducing, but it is something that helps with it. So again, some of those catch-22 situations. However, if it's not already being done, it is some low-hanging fruit that can be used to potentially help to mitigate those side effects. Sleep is another factor, and that's related to a lot of stuff, but specifically, we do know that sleep is related to weight gain. Poor sleep, inadequate sleep is related to weight gain. So that's another thing that you could look into if you're having some issues there. If there are modifications for you to make, I think that you might be able to see some side effect relief without pumping in more medications, right? Not getting into that polypharmacy territory. Plus, most of the things that we're talking about, to help with the potential side effects are also great for your mood functioning. So try to look at this with a very holistic lens. You're doing a great job with the medical side of looking at the medications, but look at the other things as well. Additional support. So talking with your family, if you have a supportive family, leaning on a partner that ends up becoming long-term and you have that trust there. Support groups or therapy groups, these are all ways to increase support in the feedback that you get, which will be especially important if you do decide to make any changes to your medications, right? You want a safety net to hold you if there are variations in mood or unexpected things that occur. So that sort of feedback mechanism is very useful. In the end, you have to recognize that what you're doing right now is making the decision to value your mental stability over the inconveniences and the stigma that medications lead to. Doesn't make those things wrong, doesn't make those things incorrect. You're making the decision to weigh one thing heavier than the other. And it sucks that you have to, but here we are. You don't have to be happy about it. You're allowed to have multiple feelings. You can feel frustrated, saddened, even pissed that you're relying on the medication. At the same time, you can intentionally tune into the gratitude you might feel for the treatments that you have access to. Recognize the positive ways that having these treatments has impacted your life. What has this allowed you to do? You can have both. Acceptance is a term you used in the question, and I think that definitely is something to work toward. You can be motivated to make as much of a difference for yourself outside of medication as you can. You could be curious about other possibilities that may present themselves over time, things that I haven't talked about that may pop up for you as options. But for now, you also need to practice some acceptance about the fact that this is your situation and you're doing the best that you can with it. Acceptance is not giving up because you clearly have not given up. I hope that helps. I don't have a perfect magic bullet answer for you here. You're doing a good thing by taking great care of your mental health. That's coming with some undesired side effects, and that's a pain in the ass. But you're not doing anything wrong. You are living this. You're going through life. You're doing the best that you can. So keep going. And, if you do have these concerns continuing forward, think about some of the things I talked about, talk about it with your care team, and you're going to be all right. Thank you for the question. All right, so on to the second question. It reads, hello, I've been listening to the Hardcore Self-Help podcast and I have a question for you that sprung to mind. When I'm in cognitive behavioral therapy to address anxiety-related concerns, I'm able to make incremental progress. However, when I'm in the throes of depression, sound advice to manage it either A, gets twisted and distorted in my mind to reconfirm my own depressive beliefs, therefore strengthening them, or B, sounds logical but feels inaccessible in that state, as though I'm a cognitive brick wall without the coordinates to find my way back to myself, despite being given directions. I am taking antidepressants. It's a catch-22. When I'm most desperate for help, I can't psychologically digest it, increasing my sense of entrapment. So my question is, in a nutshell, what can one do when the therapeutic encounter with a trusted psychologist appears to continually worsen one's mood state? what thinking shifts can be made on my end, and what approaches could my therapist and I introduce to chip away at some of that constricted thinking? Very good question. Thank you. Very well written, and I appreciate kind of how you presented things here. Off the top, I want to say that depression is a tricky bastard because it often makes you think that you are using very sound logic to arrive at your negative conclusions. In reality, when you take a step back or look at it from an external perspective, often what you're doing is mental filtering, meaning you're cherry picking out the evidence that supports the negative way you already feel, sort of like a confirmation bias. And there might be really, really strong logical ways of describing that to yourself. But when you look at it from the outside, or when you've had enough time between what you're going through right now and when you're reflecting on it, you can often see that there's a lot of evidence that you're sort of just throwing to the side that's neutral or positive. So depression is very tricky in that way. What you're describing here is basically difficulty applying what you discuss in therapy because the very emotional state that you're looking to get help with gets in the way. You described it as a catch-22, and I can totally understand why it would feel that way. It's honestly one of the reasons that I make the kind of content that I do, because I think historically a lot of mental health approaches or resources like books don't actually take into account the fact that the person ingesting the information, taking it in, is actively experiencing those difficulties. So somebody who's reading a book about depression is probably experiencing depression or anxiety or whatever issue the content is about. So that means that it's presented in a way that doesn't land for that person because they're having depression or they're too anxious, what have you. I'm not sure how long you've been working with your current therapist, but it's great that you said you're in a place where you can trust them. One ingredient here is just persistence and time. These are factors that can help you with what you're talking about here. Even if you're not able to internalize what you're discussing in the moment, you're going to likely come back to similar themes repetitively over time. And bit by bit, you can crack away at some of the habits and some of the fundamental beliefs that are holding you back. That does take time, though. I'm not sure how long you've been in therapy, so if it's been a matter of weeks or a couple months or something of that sort, you got to have some patience and stick with it. Doing work outside of therapy is also very important. Things like journaling or becoming involved with therapy groups. These are great ways to generalize the topics that you've processed in therapy and keep them at the top of your mind. Sometimes you need to look at things from a few different perspectives, or in the same perspective but in different contexts, talking with different people, writing it down instead of talking about it with your therapist, just attacking it from different angles. Sometimes one of those is what you need to hear to really click. They can also provide an avenue for processing therapy itself. You mentioned that the therapeutic encounters sometimes worsen your mood, which is something that can definitely happen. I think there's a big misconception that therapy is supposed to just make you feel better. Ideally in the long run, it's doing that, but in the shorter term, therapy is about doing the work, and that work can sometimes suck. So it's not always going to make you feel better. But having other avenues of exploration, like therapy groups, writing, etc., can help you take a look at therapy and how it made you feel, essentially using your CBT skills to look into your feelings about the CBT work you're doing, kind of a meta CBT, if you will. I'd also ask, what about work outside of CBT? One of the traps that you might be falling into here is what I would call emotional reasoning. And this is basically because you're feeling depressed, you interpret things as more hopeless and more depressing. In my book, I call it shit-colored glasses, right? You have glasses on that are kind of poopy, and so everything looks poopy, right? Just because everything has that nasty shade of brown, you interpret everything as being kind of poopy. So I think that there is some potential emotional reasoning going on here. You're already primed to feel negatively because that's what your mood state is. And so the things that are said to you, they don't land because you're interpreting them through that depressive lens. Again, it's that sort of recognizing the issue you're having when delivering the information to you sort of thing. What can be done about that, though? Aside from just digging into the thoughts and feelings and behaviors that you might be doing in CBT, are you also actively doing things that could potentially improve your mood? Behavioral activation, for instance. Behavioral activation is another therapeutic approach that focuses a lot more on action and doing things. One of the most basic things that you might do in behavioral activation is develop a list of activities that you should be engaging in. Things that were once pleasurable for you or exciting for you, or things that you would suspect that you could find pleasure in, developing a list of those things and then going through and engaging in them, even if you don't want to, essentially forcing your brain to kind of open back up and accept more dopamine. For lack of, other way of explaining it, it's just sort of like opening the door and saying, hey, dopamine, we're open for business again. If you want to start being produced, I have spots for you. And it just bit by bit kind of teaches your brain to be happy again. That's a very, very basic way of looking at the science of it. But essentially, that's what we're talking about. So behavioral activation is something that you could focus on with your therapist or with somebody else, or even on your own. I also think that there are some simple things like getting outside, getting into the sun in the morning, in the afternoon, getting physical exercise, socializing with people that you care about. All these basic things are proven in the research to improve your mood. They're not necessarily going to cure your depression, especially one of those things by themselves. But if they're chipping away at the mood difficulty, they're going to help. Think about it as if, if you're going around your day with a depression level of, say, 7 out of 10, that's pretty significant. And that's going to make you have those poopy glasses on. You're going to be interpreting things in that gross way, and you're going to be falling into that emotional reasoning trap a bit. And things are just going to kind of suck. You're not going to want to find the light in things. But with some of these basic strategies and skills, if you're able to knock that down to, say, a 4 out of 10, you're not feeling perfect, but definitely not a 7, just 3 points, suddenly that might help you to interpret things a bit differently. Another avenue for improving your mood would be adjustment of medications. You said that you're on antidepressants, but I would question if they're working for you. People respond differently to medications, and sometimes you need to make a change to a different medication within the same class, a different class of medications, adjust the dosage, or add in an adjunct medication on top of that to actually break through and give you some relief from the mood symptoms from depression. This happens a lot, actually, where, in my work day to day as a neuropsychologist, I see a lot of older folk, and I'll have people come in that are clearly horrendously depressed. Like, it's just, you can read it on them. Even if they don't have insight into the fact that they're depressed, it's very, very clear. And then you ask them, do you struggle with depression at all? Oh, no, I'm fine. I have medication for that. And you go, does the medication seem to be working? And they go, yeah, I've been on it for, 40 years. It seems to be working just fine. And in the meantime, they're like, sleeping all day. They're not appropriately feeding themselves. They have, no desire to engage socially. They're clearly depressed, right? So sometimes this just flies under the radar and it's just like, hey, tick box, I'm taking medication. I'm good. You need to reevaluate these things sometimes. There are things that can be done to adjust or change, as I mentioned. And if that's necessary, doing that can make a big difference for you. I think that you personally have a great benefit and strength in your ability to recognize patterns. You articulated how you feel when you're in a depressed state and, what you're not able to access as easily when you're there. And I'm wondering if you could maybe plan for that a bit. When you recognize that you're in a space where you're embodying that cognitive brick wall, is there something that you could do? Maybe you could reach out to increase the amount of support that you're getting, or engage in a protocol that's designed to keep you safe and just sort of wait for the mood episode to blow over. This is going to look unique to your specific situation, but it's an area where I think keeping track of things, especially, keeping track of episodes that have happened, looking back on them retrospectively and trying to understand the patterns, recognizing those patterns can help you to set yourself up for a plan for the next time that it happens. The thing is, when you're in that state, it's totally common, whether it's high anxiety or depression, when your body is, or brain is in a very emotional state, it does not want to do a lot of complex reasoning and, use your best judgment. So instead of relying on your brain to work when you're depressed, which it's not going to, you can devise a bit of a plan for your future self to carry out, right? So when you're not in the throes of depression, what might you want to do the next time you are? If you're not already writing down insights and topics that you've talked about in therapy, I would highly suggest that. Your therapist might have a notepad or something. You can also bring your own. This can help both in terms of internalizing what you've worked through and to serve as a reference. So when your brain is more muddled and you're like, I know we talked about this stuff in therapy, but I can't for the life of me call up what the fuck we talked about. You could go to your notebook and, kind of review some of those insights that you've had. And in the end, if you find that the approach to therapy that you're using isn't working out well for you, that's also totally valid. There are many different modalities of therapy. A therapist that does primarily ACT therapy or maybe psychodynamic therapy will look very different from somebody who's, pure CBT. So perhaps rather than focusing on the nuts and bolts of the CBT work, maybe you would actually benefit from some of the depth work that's done in other approaches. So for instance, if you're working with somebody who has more of a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach, maybe rather than just talking about, feelings and reactions and assumptions in everyday life, doing more inner child work, looking into your attachment figures, early stories from your life, that might be some rich pay dirt to get into. There are a lot of avenues here. It sounds like you're a very intelligent person, and in some cases that may be a detractor. You might gravitate toward CBT because you have that kind of logical nature, a lot of mental horsepower. The problem with having that mental horsepower is that your brain gets really good at also convincing you that you're wrong, or playing these games where you talk yourself out of a positive interpretation or something like that. Instead, focusing more heavily on the mood itself may be the key to moving forward. As I mentioned, there's a few ways to do that: behavioral activation, different types of therapy, different medications, physical health adjustments. It's been an episode or two since I mentioned mindfulness, so I'll just go ahead and do that now, my obligatory mindfulness statement. I think that having a consistent mindfulness practice can really help you develop the sort of cognitive efficiency and flexibility that you need. So becoming more sort of mentally agile is going to help you to not let your depressive thoughts stop you in your tracks the way that they have been. Recognizing that they're there and not necessarily trying to talk yourself out of them, but saying, okay, that's fine. Anyways, what is it that I was doing? That's a skill that can be built. And in particular, mindfulness meditation and various mindfulness practices can help you with that. So yeah, that's kind of what I have for you. I think that you're doing a good job. Have some patience, keep working on it. I imagine you're already making progress and you're going to continue to do so. So you're on the right track. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of perspective and maybe some things to think about adjusting. So thank you for the question. And with that, that is the end of the episode, everybody. This has been episode 345 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. Again, if you want to send me a question for the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. In the future, these show notes will be up at duffthepsych.com/episode 345. But as of April 5th, 2023, that is not the case yet. But stay tuned. And if you want to follow along in my journey of writing this next book, I highly encourage you to follow me on social media, especially Instagram. That's where I spend a lot of time. And then, of course, when my email list is back up and running as well, that's a great place for that. So take care of yourselves, guys. I appreciate you. I appreciate your attention, and I will see you for the next episode. Bye.